I'm afraid that my contribution will be a bit dry and boring after the passionate talks of Peter and Sylvia, but maybe the combination can still be a little bit juicy. I have three things to say. One is about what is capitalism, the other is about primitive accumulation, and the third is about their connection. Regarding the question, what is capitalism? We have seen also at this conference that there are two interpretations that seem to predominate, and they often are at loggerheads with each other, but we didn't really have a confrontation here between the different interpretations. One interpretation goes back to Adam Smith and is, for instance, defended by Immanuel Wallerstein. And it says that capitalism exists wherever there exists, as I quote Wallerstein, where a system of production for sale in a market for profit and appropriation of this profit on the basis of individual or collective ownership happens. So, according to this approach, it does not matter what kind of social relations exist within the production system, like serfdom or slavery or wage labor. What matters is only the type of economic behavior which is oriented towards market sales and profit making. The other interpretation has its source in the Marxian tradition, and Marx, as you know, called capitalism a generalized commodity production. And this interpretation says that capitalism exists when not just the goods and services created by the production system take the form of commodities, but also that all the inputs in the system, including labor, resources, means of production, are purchased as commodities. So this is a much narrower definition. And I think that I agree with the second approach. But this is something we will definitely not all agree on. I think that capitalism can be seen as the competitive accumulation of capital based on commodification. So capitalism articulates a cyclical process in which tendentially, as to borrow an expression from Piero Sraffa, production of commodities by means of commodities takes place. It is a progressing circulation of commodity production and distribution, such that not just the labor products, but also the means of production and labor capacity, labor power, acquire the status of commodities. Now, a point which was very interesting at our conference is that the commodification of human labor capacity, of labor power, does not necessarily, as has been said very often in the past, does not necessarily have to take the form of wage labor, but it can also be based on pure physical coercion, as in the case of, for instance, chattel slavery. This is, I think, is one of the big achievements of our conference, is that I've heard no real objection to the idea that slaves can also produce surplus value, which is a break with Marxist orthodoxy. We should think a bit more about this. I already said something about yesterday. I think that if we take this seriously, then we also have to reflect further on the theoretical implications. I give you two examples why I say this. One is, for instance, in Capital 3, Marx says, the slaveholder has paid cash for his slaves, and so the product of their labor represents the interest on the capital invested in their purchase. So here, the slave is considered capital, not constant capital. And the other thing is that Marx says in volume 1, as we all know, that labor power can, quote again, appear on the market as a commodity only if and insofar as its possessor, the individual whose labor power it is, offers it for sale or sells it as a commodity. In order that its possessor may sell it as a commodity, he must have it at his disposal. He must be the free proprietor of his own labor capacity, hence of his person. So only with a free wage laborer can you have a capitalist transaction between a worker and the capitalist. So if we say that the slave can produce surplus value, then we have to rethink all these issues. I will not do this now, but I think that is something that we should consider. Nevertheless, by the way, although we talked a lot about slavery, it remains true that capitalism's most important innovation, I think, is the vast expansion of wage labor in later stages of its development. And we didn't talk so much about wage labor, which we could have done more. Anyway, essential for capitalism, however defined, is whether the broad definition of the Smithian definition or the Marxian definition, what is happening in capitalism, as we can see, certainly in advanced capitalism, is the transformation of outputs and inputs of labor processes into goods and services which both have a use value and an exchange value. So they meet both the needs of particular consumers, this can be individuals, enterprises, or institutions, and which can be traded in definite proportions for other commodities. Capitalism cannot exist, and I think we agree on this, without commodity production and commodity trade. Yet, commodities are not a standalone phenomenon. Their existence always presupposes the presence of at least three other phenomena. Property rights, of course, because you can only sell something if it's your property. Money, to get paid for it, and competition. And these three elements, and competition has to be regulated. So these three elements, property rights, money, and competition, presuppose the intervention of the state. And here comes in what Jairus said and what others have also remarked, that the state is a crucial aspect of the process of accumulation in capitalism, and also of course, in primitive accumulation, to which I come now. Second question, therefore, is what is primitive accumulation? I think that primitive accumulation, well, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the literature and in discussions on what that is. Usually, or not usually, but very often, it is reduced to dispossession. If you have dispossession, then you have primitive accumulation. This is not correct, I think. I think that primitive accumulation is the combination of three elements. The first element is there must be accumulation of wealth. Doesn't matter how this wealth has been acquired, can be through robbery, through selling inheritance or whatever. You need money or means of production as forms of wealth. The second is you need expropriation of immediate producers. This is what we have discussed extensively. Marx talks, for instance, about the expropriation of the agricultural producer, of the peasant from the soil, which is the basis of the whole process. And this assumes many different aspects in different countries, as he says. And the third, so we have expropriated direct producers, we have accumulation of wealth, and then the third and essential element is the combination of both. This can happen in several ways, of course. In Capital 3, Marx described three ways in which the merchant, for instance, can become a productive capitalist. I will, for change, quote Engels, who described three historical origins of productive industrial capital. Quote, the Middle Ages already saw, and so we should start earlier, this is the first implication of this, the Middle Ages already saw the beginnings of this in three particular areas: shipping, mining, and textiles. Shipping on the scale pursued by the Italian and Hanseatic maritime republics was impossible without sailors as wage laborers whose wage relationship might be concealed under the cooperative form of a share in the profit, or for the galleys of that time without oarsmen who were either wage laborers or slaves. The mining companies, which originally consisted of workers cooperating with each other, had already been transformed in almost all cases into joint stock companies for exploiting the mines by wage labor. And in the textile industry, the merchant began to take small master weavers directly into his service, supplying them with yarn and having this transformed into cloth on his own account against a fixed wage, becoming instead of a simple merchant a so-called putter out. So there are many more variations, of course, but so Marx and Engels were very clearly aware of the many different forms this could take and how early it already started. Now, as I said, usually discussions on primitive accumulation focus on the point of expropriation, and then it is mostly also by predecessors here in this session interpreted as a sudden and violent process. But I would say, and here I disagree with the both of you a little bit, that there have been other cases. Expropriation can also happen in a non-physically violent way. And it has often happened in a non-physically violent way. But there's more to it. There are different degrees of separation of the producer from the means of production. You have complete separation, of course, and you have partial separation. And partial separation may refer to a part of the inputs in the labor process, but it can also refer to time arrangements. For instance, forced part-time labor, you have many of these forms, of course, kinds of capitalist corvée, as the Dutch introduced in Java in the 19th century, that kind of thing. Producers, this is another important point, producers who have been completely expropriated can be transformed into chattel slaves. Producers who still own their labor capacity can become wage laborers. So wage laborers are not completely expropriated from their means of production. Only slaves are completely expropriated from their means of production. This is an unclarity which in many Marxist discourses resurfaces. Then expropriation can be gradual or it can be abrupt. And it can also, as Don said in the previous session, can be spatially separated in the place of expropriation can be separated from the place where the worker is again integrated into the capitalist accumulation process. And then, of course, as I said, it can be violent, physically violent or not physically violent. There are other ways of, capitalism has developed all kinds of ways to bring people to expropriation of their means of production. Seduction is also one of those. And of course, in this course of primitive accumulation, we see lots of forms of resistance, and we heard eloquently Sylvia and Peter talking about this, and we also heard yesterday from Jairus correctly that, of course, primitive accumulation may fail. It may be a process which cannot be brought to its end. Partial separation is, I think, instead of complete separation, is the oldest form of expropriation of producers. Has existed for thousands of years, for instance, when peasants had to work their lands or part of their labor time for a landlord. So it means that part of their labor time or their land is expropriated in the forms of the different forms of ground rent that are discussed in volume 3 of Capital, labor rent, rent in kind, money rent, and so on. Now, finally, the combination of primitive accumulation and capitalist accumulation. This is something we have not really explored deeply, but needs more reflection, I think. But I would say that the capitalist world system, world economy, sorry, not system, world economy, is an articulated system of capitalist, semi-capitalist, and pre-capitalist relations of production, which are linked to each other through exchange and are dominated by the capitalist world market. And the shaping of this whole structure is, of course, much determined by social struggles. And the growth of the capitalist mode of production since the late 18th century can, I think, be seen as a dialectical unity of three moments. The ongoing capital accumulation in the domain of the already capitalist processes of production, ongoing primitive accumulation outside the domain of the already consolidated capitalist processes, and of course the determination and limitation of the second element, the primitive accumulation, by the first struggle and competition which happens between the first moment and the second moment. Thank you.